On the night of July 25, 2025, in a valley on the mainland of Australia, a thermal camera captured something the government of this country insists cannot exist. A storm was moving through the Yarra Valley, driving rain, howling wind. The kind of night that empties a landscape. And for hours, that is exactly what the valley looked like on the thermal feed. Empty. No kangaroos grazing, no movement at the tree line. Silence. Then a single gray kangaroo entered the frame, moving fast, not grazing, not cautious. It was running the way an animal runs when something is behind it. Moments later, something followed. A quadruped, low to the ground, nose pressed to the earth, tracking, not scanning the way a fox scans, not loping the way a wild dog lopes. This animal was doing something else. It was following a scent trail that led directly into the darkness beyond the camera's field of view. The thermal footage lasts only a few seconds, but what happened next was recorded in a different way. The following afternoon, July 26th, the man who set the cameras returned to the exact clearing where the kangaroo had disappeared into the trees. He walked in and found a wedge-tailed eagle standing on the ground. Beside the eagle was a freshly killed adult kangaroo. The neck was broken. The ears had been bitten, the internal organs had been removed cleanly, and the stomach and intestines lay in the grass 5 meters away from the body. There was no blood scattered, no hair, no drag marks. The hind legs and the tail were untouched. Beside the head, deposited on the ground, was a fresh scat, not on the carcass, next to it, as if the killer had marked the kill and walked away. Foxes do not kill adult kangaroos. Wild dogs and dingoes do, but the pattern is different. Bites to the hindquarters, blood, mess. Feral cats have been proposed as an explanation for kills like this one, but their existence in Australia at the scale required has never been proven. There is one predator, historically native to this exact region, whose recorded hunting behavior was said to include a bite to the head or neck, and consumption of the internal organs first. That predator has been officially extinct on mainland Australia for roughly 3,000 years and officially extinct in Tasmania since 1936. The man who filmed the footage has recorded 3 separate encounters in this same valley. One in September 2023, one in September 2024, one in July 2025. Each closer, each harder to dismiss. This is not the first time evidence like this has surfaced in Australia. And the last time it did, the last time it really did, with a witness credible enough that the state's own wildlife director publicly certified the sighting, the Australian government responded in a way that has never been fully explained. They buried it. At 2 in the morning, on a wet night in March of 1982, in the forests of northwest Tasmania, a government wildlife officer opened the window of his truck, shone a spotlight into the dark, and stared for 3 full minutes at an animal his own government had declared extinct 46 years earlier. He counted 12 stripes across its back. He watched it open its jaw in the slow, impossible gape that no other predator on Earth performs. He noted the wet fur, the pale yellow reflection of its eyes, the calm posture of an adult male in excellent condition. Then he did what any professional government wildlife officer would do. He filed a report. His own government kept that report a secret for the next 15 months. This is the story of what Hans Narding saw in the rain in March of 1982. Of the 2 years his own agency then spent quietly searching for the animal without telling the public. Of the young biologist they put in charge of that search, a man named Nick Mooney, who has now admitted in his own words to a journalist that he actively misled the public about what he was doing in those forests. And of the reason a second Tasmanian ranger, 13 years later, would file a nearly identical report from a different forest and watch the government bury that one too. None of this is theory. None of it is conspiracy. All of it is public record. And all of it raises a question the Australian government has never satisfactorily answered. If the sighting was as credible as its own director publicly claimed, why did they hide it? Hans Narding was not a hobbyist. He was a Dutch-born naturalist with 2 decades of field experience across Africa and Australia. He worked for the Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Service. On the night in question, he was near a place called Tugari, east of Marawa, conducting a snipe survey. When the weather turned, he pulled off the disused forest track, climbed into the back of his Land Cruiser, and went to sleep. At 2 in the morning, something woke him. He grabbed his spotlight out of habit, opened the window, put his arm out into the rain, and swept the beam through the dark. His own words, written down for the official record, describe what happened next. The beam came to rest on a large thylacine, standing side-on some 6 to 7 meters from the vehicle. He decided to examine the animal carefully before risking any movement. He counted 12 black stripes running down a sandy coat. The eye reflection was pale yellow. It was, he wrote, a full-grown male in excellent physical condition. And then it did the one thing that erased any last doubt. It opened its jaw. The gape, that impossibly wide hinge, nearly 80 degrees, that no other carnivore on Earth performs. The mouth of an animal that had been dead, according to every official document in Australia, for 46 years. Narding's camera was out of reach on the back seat. He was afraid that any movement would end the encounter, so for 3 full minutes, he simply watched. Then, the animal stepped off the track and vanished into the bush. Narding drove out. He wrote up his report. He submitted it through official channels to his superiors at the Parks and Wildlife Service. And then, for reasons the Tasmanian government has never publicly explained, the report disappeared from public view. For 15 months, the state's own wildlife agency told no one. Not the press, not the scientific community, not the taxpayers who had funded decades of thylacine surveys. The report was placed under internal review, and a covert search was launched in the same forests where Narding had seen the animal. If this is the first time you're hearing this story, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel investigates the wildlife cases the official record refuses to close. There are more coming. The person put in charge of the covert search was Nick Mooney, then a young biologist with the Parks and Wildlife Service. And in 2018, decades later, sitting in his kitchen with a journalist from The New Yorker named Brooke Jarvis, Mooney admitted something that changes everything about how this story is usually told. While the search was ongoing, curious locals kept asking him what he was doing out in the Tugari forests for months at a time. He lied to them. He told them he was studying eagles. He wasn't studying eagles. He was searching for the animal his colleague Narding had seen, on the direct instructions of the Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Service. The lie was operational. It was deliberate. And it was made necessary by the fact that the government had chosen, for 15 months, to hide the most credible thylacine sighting in the history of the state's own wildlife service. The Parks and Wildlife Service director at the time was a man named Peter Murrell. When the report finally became public, Murrell did not hedge. He did not qualify. He described the Narding sighting as the best in the history of the service. The 2 words he used on the record are the reason this story has never gone away: irrefutable and conclusive. The senior wildlife authority in Tasmania was telling the world that one of his own rangers had seen an animal the state itself had declared extinct. And still, for over a year, no one outside a small circle inside the agency knew, while the biologist running the search was in the field, telling anyone who asked that he was studying eagles. For 2 years, Mooney and Dr. Eric Geiler, one of the leading thylacine researchers of the 20th century, combed the Tugari forests. They laid trail markers. They cataloged tracks. They ran surveys through the dense bushland Narding had described, and they found nothing. Not a body, not a den, not a photograph, not a single scat sample that could be tested against known thylacine DNA. When the search collapsed, the government finally made its move. The Narding file was released to the public, but the search was quietly wound down at the same time. The message the state delivered was clean. We investigated. We failed. Narding himself was left to absorb what the 15 months of silence had cost him. Within a week of the public disclosure, television crews from 3 continents were on his doorstep. He could not do his job. He told the Hobart Mercury newspaper years later that if he had known what was going to happen, he would have kept his trap shut. He called it a curse. He left Tasmania shortly afterwards. The most credible thylacine sighting in the history of the state's own wildlife service, by the state's own definition, ended with the witness leaving Tasmania and the file being closed without an answer. That should be where this story ends. Except 13 years later, it happened again. On the 25th of January, 1995, a second Parks and Wildlife Ranger was working in a different corner of Tasmania. His name was Charlie Beasley. He was in the northeast, near a place called Piangana, identifying birds in dense bushland in the early hours of the morning. Across a gully, in the pale light before sunrise, he saw an animal that stopped him where he stood. He raised his binoculars. He watched it for 2 full minutes. He described it later in specific detail. Dark black stripes across the back, the head of a Staffordshire Terrier, a long tapered snout, roughly half the size of an adult German Shepherd, which meant, if his identification was correct, he had just watched a juvenile Tasmanian tiger. Beasley filed his report through the same agency, up the same chain of command. The Parks and Wildlife Service opened a second file. Another follow-up search was quietly run, and once again, no physical evidence emerged. The file was closed. 2 rangers, 13 years apart, 2 independent, professionally trained wildlife officers. 2 files opened and shut by the same government agency that had officially certified the species extinct nearly 6 decades earlier. And in both cases, the exact same institutional response. Investigate. Fail to confirm. Close the file. Move on. For nearly 90 years, the official position on the thylacine has been fixed. It went extinct in 1936. The last one died in a zoo. Everything since is misidentification, wishful thinking, or fraud. And then, in 2023, the science caught up. A team led by Professor Barry Brook of the University of Tasmania published a study in the journal Science of the Total Environment. They pulled every credible thylacine sighting recorded since 1910. 1,237 of them. They ranked each one by corroboration, geographic pattern, and observer credibility. Then they ran the entire dataset through modern extinction modeling. The conclusion was not 1936. It was not the 1950s. Their statistical model placed the most likely extinction date decades later than the official record, potentially into the 1980s. In some scenarios, later still. Which means that when Hans Narding shone his spotlight into the rain in March of 1982, the science now suggests he may have been looking at exactly what he thought he was looking at. And here is what no one in the Australian government has ever satisfactorily explained. If the sighting was credible enough for the Director of Parks and Wildlife to personally certify as irrefutable, why was the report hidden for 15 months? Why was the biologist in charge of the search authorized or instructed to lie about what he was doing? If the same pattern repeated in 1995 with a second ranger in a second forest, why did that trigger no policy response, no reopened case, no formal admission that the state's own trained personnel had now filed 2 separate credible reports of an animal that officially does not exist? The obvious explanation is the boring one, that the searches failed because the sightings, however credible, were not enough. That agencies have finite budgets and cannot chase every ghost. But there is a second explanation that fits the record just as well, that formally admitting the thylacine might still exist would trigger consequences the state has spent decades avoiding. Land use restrictions, protected habitat designations, legal exposure over historical bounty payments, political liability for a species the government itself may have declared extinct too soon. You do not have to believe the second explanation to notice that the government's behavior fits it. The forest where Narding saw his thylacine is gone now, cleared for logging. Bob Brown, the co-founder of the Australian Greens political party and a veteran of the thylacine search era, pointed this out to the same journalist Nick Mooney spoke to. The specific stretch of Togari bushland where the most credible sighting in the history of the Parks and Wildlife Service was recorded no longer exists. The habitat has been erased. the archive remains closed. And in the Yarra Valley on the mainland, 2,800 kilometers to the north, thermal cameras keep recording a quadruped that no official document acknowledges. In September of 2023, in September of 2024, in July of 2025, in the same valley, in the same 100 meters, always around the same time of year, each encounter closer than the last. The forest where Narding saw his thylacine is gone, but the animal, whatever it was, whatever it still is, has apparently not stopped moving. If a trained wildlife officer on the payroll of the same government that declared the species extinct watches a Tasmanian tiger for 3 full minutes at close range, and his own agency then buries the report